Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson, and I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. And I have over 14 years of collective experience as a registered social worker and 5 years as a therapist. In this video, I'm going to be talking about cult-like dynamics and how it can be applied to narcissistic families. And so I'm going to take particularly from Steve Hassan. So he has a book about cult mind control, which is a very popular book in the field of cult dynamics and literature. And so in his book, he talks about the BITE model. So BITE stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotions. And so I'm going to break down that model and how you can apply it to the narcissistic family, particularly with the case with the parents being the narcissists, or I guess one parent being the narcissist and perhaps there being a codependent, but usually the siblings are also roped in to this cult-like dynamic in the family. So with regards to narcissism and cult-like dynamics, when I've been researching understandings of narcissism, particularly within a dysfunctional family, often it will come clear to me, or it did become clear to me, that these families operate very much similar to a cult. And I would say the more dysfunctional, the more these families are. And I have had a few clients where this has actually been quite evident that they're in a cult-like dynamic in terms of their family. And sometimes this can be the case that it's tied up with religion in terms of the parents being overly religious. But it's not always, it's usually the case that even though they're said to be religious, the parents tend to just use that as a way to control the family and the kids. And so I'm thinking about one client I had where for most of their life they were trapped in the house in a lot of ways. So the parents would very much control who they would see, who they would interact with, the information that would get in and out. So that goes to the first aspect of Hassan's theory in terms of the notion that there is behavior. So what the cult does, and in this case the narcissistic family dynamic, is they control the behavior of the children. They will control when you sleep, when you eat. Usually it's obviously the case when they're younger that this would be more pronounced. It goes to, I think, because the notion of the narcissist and them having a lack of boundaries and them merging with life and with the children. And so they very much will use food and their body and what they wear, and they feel entitled to the kids to control these things. There's overlap with daughters having eating disorders due to this. I wanted to highlight that they control the behavior of the children. They'll control the information from the inside in terms of the siblings and how they interact and what they tell each other. There's no information that can be kept secret in these families, as the siblings will tell on usually it's the scapegoat or any child that is, sharing information that speaks to the truth of this dynamic or to the narcissist. Within the family unit, information is controlled. Typically, it's this splitting that is occurring with the narcissist splitting the children into all good and all bad. And so they will have the golden child, the scapegoat, the lost child. These children will, from a young age, be set up in a competition with one another. This isn't just in a relatively healthy family. There's always some level of sibling rivalry and maybe some competition, but usually that's not to a point, right, where it's at such a stake where they can be ostracized, being the scapegoat, or it being such, usually there's going to be some love and care, right, regardless of whether that child is successful or has some attention. The family acts as a cult, controlling information within the family unit. And so there's emotional fusion if you take Bowen family therapy. So the notion that there's the undifferentiated collective ego mass, typically the parents and either one of the parents or both the parents basically emotionally fusing with the family and with the children, so that information is kept within the family. And so there's no feedback loop within these families. And so if there's narcissistic injury where the narcissist will get in narcissistic rage towards the children and have a very big outburst. Typically, it can be the case that if it's the grandiose narcissist, they'll typically have more of rage, like more overtly angry, whereas the covert narcissist will maybe be more subtle and more covert in their manipulation and gaslighting techniques. Perhaps they still will have rage, but it will be kept contained more likely, Whereas the grandiose narcissist, if that's, let's say one parent is grandiose and the other is covert, perhaps it's, let's say, the father who is more of anger and overtly shows his display of anger and his narcissistic injury and rage. Whereas the covert narcissist will usually be more subtle, possibly smearing the child in terms of the scapegoat with the other children, or flying monkeys, enablers in the family unit or associated with the family. And so with regards to information, it's also information from outside. So in these families, it's typically the case that they will protect the information in terms of any form of objective feedback from the world, in terms of especially criticism of the family or the way in which it's operating. So perhaps you have, let's say, some authority, like a teacher maybe speaking into the family, like offering criticism. Any criticism or feedback from the external world is going to be distorted. And so the family and the parents will distort that information and favor them and ensure that information is not getting in. And the typical way that a family will do this is, at least I can go back to that other example of my client, is for most of his life, he was very much subjugated to his family and to his home. This is particularly the case during COVID, where they weren't to go out. He had little friends, and the only time he could go out is mostly to school. When he turned 18, 19 and was going off to university, he was able to get that freedom. And from that was able to observe the family and just get a little more objectivity in terms of the family. But with this client, he very much knew just through that this family was acting as a cult. They would control the information. They had a predetermined plan: go to this school, this university, temple, and so they would have this containment of the way they wanted it to go. When he started to rebel or assert his identity and individuate, that was seen as a threat to the family cult system. Often it can be the oldest enforcing the parents, saying this scapegoat or child isn't being loyal. There's a sense of fear if you stand up against the family cult. You're going to be ostracized. It's confusing as there's fear and love bombing. They won't beat you over the head in terms of not being loyal, but they will typically love bomb you at first and get their hooks into you first and get you basically to internalize this sense of guilt and shame that the family is going to project onto typically the scapegoat. And so the siblings, out of that fear, don't want to go along with the scapegoat, even though they might recognize a degree of the truth. But within a cult dynamic, there's a notion, according to Steve Hassan, the notion that there's thought stopping. So anytime the scapegoat might bring out information that is critical of the parents or of the family, there'll be thought stopping, so they'll stop them from thinking this way. And because perhaps the scapegoat doesn't want to have such a divide and have this disharmony in the family, perhaps they'll go along with the oldest in terms of the enforcer and come to just align with the enforcement of the family. Over time, as they become more individuated and perhaps observe other families and understand how they're being emotionally neglected and abused in the situation, they'll typically speak up more. There's no way the family as a collective can contain the information. If the scapegoat becomes stronger, they will stand up for themselves and leave the family. The other aspect is thoughts. In Steve Hassan's model on cult dynamics, he talks about the third, thoughts. They'll control your thoughts and do thought stopping. And it's interesting in cult-like dynamics, particularly if it's a religious or spiritual context, they might do things like have rituals. And you see this sort of in certain, if there's like a protest, like an Antifa or leftist protests, they also act like a cult. They'll control the information, so they won't let any members talk typically to any kind of reporters or any people out there that are in opposition to the Antifa or to this group that they're promoting and the cause they're promoting. So they'll control the information, and they'll also, so they'll act like that as a kind of a clique, a kind of collective, and they will act like as though it's a cult. They'll do rituals where they repeat certain phrases for several hours. There's a training that occurs and certain ways in which the cult is aligning any sense of individuality is being erased by the group collective, by things like this, like the collective sharing into these rituals and into the groupthink of the cult. And in any healthy community, there's going to be a respect of the autonomy of the individual, but also have communion. But in a cult-like dynamic, it's only communion, and the communion is based off of the narcissist. So within a cult, let's say a spiritual community, it could be a guru controlling the sense of communion. So there's groupthink. You're not allowed to challenge the status quo or narrative of the cult. They usually have answers to any questions or criticisms. They'll use tactics to really get into the mind of the individual and get them basically to internalize and the cult-like thinking, so that basically they'll police themselves. If you think about the book 1984, there's aspects where Winston is tortured. You could examine how cults operate in a similar way, like they'll break you down and they'll make you question. So the reality testing will be outsourced to the collective, to the group. And it's interesting because we all obviously want to belong, and so there's belonging needs. And perhaps it's the case that people grow up in a narcissistic family, and then they'll join a cult maybe because they're still feeling like they don't belong, and so they never had that need met. And so out of that insecurity, they'll get attracted perhaps to a cult because it gives a very rigid structure and the answer's already given. They can outsource reality testing to the group or guru and not think for themselves. If for many years you've been groomed in a narcissistic family, then it's perhaps the case that you get into a cult of a cult of two, a romantic relationship with a narcissist. It can act as a cult in terms of this bite model. And then it can also be the case that you actually join a cult, or it could be a religious group that is overly zealous in terms of their commitment to the practices and not allowing any form of information in, controlling the behavior, like who the cult members see and interact with, including their own family. So typically they'll isolate the victim or the target, and so they won't have any association with the family. So there can't be any outside information essentially affecting that person. And so in that book, Steve goes through, he was in it was the Moonies, I believe. It's a religious group, and he goes into how he's helped others out of that. And it's typically this case that these members are very much controlled, their thoughts are controlled, and they have outsourced their reality testing to the group or to the cult members, guru, teacher, pastor, or leader. The last aspect of the bite model is emotions. So yeah, very much they will get into your emotions and ensure that you're getting connected emotionally to the cult. And so they'll provide you like a love-like dynamic, but it really isn't love. It's just what they basically try to convince you that it is love, but in reality it's control. In cult-like dynamics, in terms of, if you think about like a guru, there's a notion of enlightenment. So in traditional Eastern traditions, there's usually, at least if you take Buddhism, there's the notion of a satsang, so the community. Then there's the guru, so there's the teacher. And then there's your own individual practice, or it could also be scripture in terms of either like the Bible or maybe the Sanskrit, or looking into it depends on which group. We all need community. We all, like, it's all good to have a mentor or a teacher. It could be the case that these communities turn into cult-like dynamics. There's groupthink, and the guru said to be enlightened. There's a sense that they have absolutely know, so they basically reached enlightenment, so they're all-knowing. It's godlike. And so I've always found this interesting because, when you've had genuine experience in spirituality in terms of glimpsing what you could see as absolute spirit, and you become a knower of that, and you have had real realization in terms of spirit and to the absolute, there's genuine spiritual insights that can be known, is evident with a lot of these teachers or gurus. And so it's not as though they're completely fabricating all of this. Usually these gurus can be very charming, but there's a distinction. They're still human and have their own shadow, their own psyche. Perhaps they've had glimpses and insights into the absolute, so they are grounded in a realization and have become enlightened within at least a traditional context. But as we know in the West and just psychology, the notions that we're developing, and then there's also aspects of our psyche that still perhaps haven't been integrated. It could be the case that the guru has a realization and is grounded in that, but their psyche is still not developed and could be narcissistic. It's hard to discern between realization and narcissism, because a narcissist believes that they're superior and feel godlike. Sam Vaknin speaks about this and the notion that the narcissist has their false self and it's like their deity. So they've sacrificed themselves to this false self from a very young age, and they expect that you do the same in terms of a cult-like dynamic. You're devoting yourself and this community to the false self of the guru, believing it is absolute or that it's a godlike person, but they are narcissistic. I just wanted to speak about how it's interesting, these dynamics that occur within these communities and just how this works. So within a family unit, this can be similar in the sense that perhaps the parents aren't like guru or like teachers, but they very much believe they're all-knowing or superior to you. It's confusing because, like a cult-like dynamic, it's typically right that you would get attracted to this community and you would start maybe attending some of their meetings, and over time they erode your individuality, then you're parroting and internalized a lot of this cult-like dynamics, this control and the sense of the policing of your behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions. The family operates similar to a cult in the sense that the parents, and it could be one parent or both parents, act as like cult leaders. And so you are to sacrifice yourself to their false self as a deity or godlike. The siblings, particularly the golden child typically, or it's usually the oldest, will enforce this narrative of the family being perfect or close to perfect. And you're to go along with that. And if you question it, you'll often be ostracized or just smeared, and your name will be smeared. And typically, maybe over time, you start to question more, and the family will become more and more suspicious and malign your name. So when you come home, perhaps from several months, you haven't seen your family, and then you find that others in the community, it could be just family friends, will start looking at you a certain way, or extended family, they for some reason don't really want to talk to you, or might start asking you questions like, are you okay? I heard that you've been maybe struggling. And so there's always these questions like, what is being shared about me? And so, because you would assume that in a family, right, that they would speak kindly and be supportive, but then you had questions about you and your mental health, or so they start to pick at your self-esteem, and so that you don't have any sense of independence from the family cult. But then at some point, I think you leave maybe that dynamic and you set a boundary, but that boundary is seen as sacrilegious. It's not something you can do within a family cult. No information gets in, no information within the family system. It's controlled by the siblings and also by the parents, acting similar to a cult member or similar to cult leaders. And so in this video, I covered Steve Hassan's BITE model, particularly applying it to the narcissistic family, and so how there can be similarities between cult-like dynamics that you see in cults, and then also how you can see it in narcissistic families. So if you like this video, please subscribe. Thanks and have a great day.